Hi, welcome again. This is Coach Ruth Waithera of the Soul Clinic. At the Soul Clinic is where we fix your pain, we help you feel good so that you can live a whole life. We have been doing episodes on trauma. We have been doing a series on trauma, and this is episode 3. I don't know whether you have watched episode 1 and 2. I would advise you that you check them out in the comment section so that you're able to follow through this series so that you can gain the most out of it. So the first series we talked about what trauma is and what trauma is not. In the second series, we talked about how our core beliefs can revolve around our unresolved trauma and why it's important for you to process your traumas so that you create an identity that is accurate and that supports the version of you that you want to become. So in today's episode, I want us to go a bit deeper into adverse childhood experiences. I had mentioned them in episode 1, and I'm thinking we need to look at them a bit deeper because what we went through as children really shapes how we show up as adults. Our family of origin and the circumstances surrounding our birth and surrounding our upbringing, especially from the ages of 0 to 7, are very critical in our lives and in shaping our core beliefs and who we are, how we show up in life, and how we view, and they greatly impact our self-worth. Not all trauma is acute, because when we talk about trauma, some people think of one incident, one major incident that could have happened to you that changed the trajectory of your life and how you view yourself. So that is normally what is called acute trauma, one major incident. So not all trauma is one single traumatic experience or one major incident that is not processed. We normally have what is called chronic trauma as well. Chronic trauma is the trauma that is brought about by multiple incidents or prolonged exposure to traumatic experiences. So if you, for example, you were raised in a childhood where trauma was part of your day-to-day living, you are likely going to have what is called chronic trauma. So you may have found yourself in experiences where every day you had to come up and to create survival adaptation mechanisms, because if you didn't do that, then that environment was likely going to be very overwhelming for you, and because you needed to survive. Remember, we say that trauma is an adaptation mechanism. In order for you to survive, you needed to create some coping mechanisms so that the whole situation doesn't get overwhelming. And why I want us to look at advanced childhood experiences, because in our very early years, in our formative years, our primary caregivers, our parents, our guardians, play a very key role in our survival. So as a child, even if you went through traumatic experience in the hands of your primary caregivers, you had to develop some coping mechanisms, because for you at that moment, you are very vulnerable and your survival heavily relied on those primary caregivers. So you couldn't go against them. You couldn't allow yourself to view them as threats because they were the very essence of your survival. So that continued exposure to traumatic experiences greatly affected how you view yourself and how you show up in life. So many of us have these experiences that we had as children that are very unprocessed. And for our survival to happen, we also created narratives around those stories, narratives that are not threatening, because if we created narratives that threatened our very existence in a family setup, it would have become very overwhelming. So we create narratives that support our survival alertness. And many of those narratives are, I had a good childhood. Because we don't want to go back there, we don't want to see how our environment growing up could have shaped our very warped or very dysfunctional view of self. So we create safe narratives, we create safe stories. However, those safe stories that we created may not support the versions of us that we are trying to become as adults. So for you to be able to become that version, you may need to go back to those early stages of your life and evaluate. Are there things, are there incidences, are there experiences that were traumatic? Whether those experiences were caused by a primary caregiver or not, or those experiences and those threats were just within the environment in which you resided. Or those experiences are things that happened to you and they were not given the due attention and the response that was supportive, that affirmed your worth. So whatever that experience could be, whether it was deliberate or not, conscious or not, it deeply defines who you are and how you show up as a person. So you may need to start challenging some of the narratives and the core beliefs you hold around your child. You may need to start evaluating those, because if you don't evaluate them, they will continue to direct your life and you will call it as fate. You look at it as fate, while in reality, there are some things that could have happened there that shape how you view yourself, that shape how you show up. And I know most of us don't want to go there because we don't want to start viewing our parents as bad people. That's not the essence of doing these exercises. That's not the essence of doing these evaluations. The essence of doing these evaluations is not to label our backgrounds as bad. It's not to label our primary caregivers as evil people. It's not to label our mother as a bad person, or our father as a bad person, or that uncle, or that grandmother, or that guardian, or whoever that is in the situation. It is to acknowledge and to take responsibility of our emotional and our mental health. Because whether you acknowledge what happened or not, it's going to affect your life. So when you are doing your evaluation of your adverse childhood experiences, or what we call ACEs, or what I like to call SEs, there are some things that you may need to look into. For example, some of the things you may need to consider when you are trying to assess onto the effects of those experiences in your life is, were you a child, for example, that was very sickly? Were you a child that had to deal with a lot of pain? Were you a child living in disabilities? Because if you are a child living in disabilities, for example, it really affected your self-worth, especially depending on how it was taken and how it was addressed by your family of origin, by the primary caregivers, by your earliest schoolmates and your earliest teachers and the people you interacted with as a child. You may also need to look into, was there any form of verbal abuse in your home? Sexual abuse, did you experience sexual abuse as a child? Were you sodomized or you were sexually assaulted? Was there emotional abuse? Even if that abuse was not directed to you. You could have lived in a neighborhood where your parents were very abusive to each other, or you had a parent that was very abusive towards your siblings, and you knew they were terror. And the only way to make sure that that terror was never directed to you was to confine yourself and to conform to a certain mode of being, whether that mode of being meant that you had to disown or dissociate with parts of yourself so that you could be in the good books, so that that level of emotional abuse is also not directed to you. So did you have also sickly parents or siblings or relatives that you lived with, or people that were dealing with critical illness or illnesses that you didn't understand? Because those situations bring with them a lot of fear in the family, a lot of uncertainty, and as you grow up in that kind of environment, you also are likely going to be on high alert a lot, because you don't know what could happen to that sickly parent or that sickly sibling or that sickly relative anytime. So if you had such an environment, then you may need to evaluate and assess, how did it affect the way I show up, the way I view myself, the way I view the world, the way I view the other people? Did you grow up in a neighborhood, in a family where children were to be seen and not to be heard? Because it meant that you had to silence your voice, you had to silence your mind, you couldn't speak up, you couldn't express yourself freely. So how did that affect your ability to speak up, your ability to set boundaries, your ability to show up in the way that you'd want to show up? Another thing that you may need to look into is, were you raised in a family where there were too many secrets to keep? That as a family, it was clear that we had a narrative to be able to protect our family dysfunctions, to be able to protect the things that were happening in our family, in our closed environment. We had to keep a lot of secrets, and it was open among us. We had to have a narrative, and that narrative had to rhyme amongst the siblings. It had to rhyme with what our mother is saying. It had to rhyme with what our father is saying. Those are very traumatic experiences as a child, because it means that you have to disown and dissociate with parts of yourself. It means that you had to conform yourself to a very uncomfortable situation. So how does that affect you today? Did you come from a family where there was a lot of alcohol and drug abuse? Maybe your parent was a drug addict. They are the ones that, would be found by the roadside. They have slept by the roadside in a ditch somewhere. How does that shape you? How does that feel when you're in your peers? Does it form an identity that is very shame-based? Because if your identity is shame-based, it's going to show up for you today. So if you had a parent that was into serious addiction and it was no secret, everybody knew that your parent is the one that drinks, or in your home is where you make the local illegal brews, so there are policemen and the area chief coming into your neighborhood, into your home every so often. It's likely going to affect how you view yourself, and you are likely going to have a very shame-based identity. And when your identity is shame-based, it will stand in the way. It will hinder you from becoming the best version of yourself. There are just some parts of you that you're not able to access because of the shame that stands between you and them. The other thing you need to look into is, did you come from unsafe neighborhoods? Was it safe for you to go to the shop alone? Was it safe for you to go to the market alone? Was it safe for you to go to the farm alone? Or was it safe for you to just be in the neighborhood by yourself? Because that really impacts the way you view the world, the way you view people. Is the world a safe or an unsafe place? Because if you come into the world now as an adult with those core beliefs that the world is an unsafe place, you are likely going to attract people and situations that affirm that view about yourself. They will affirm that actually the world is unsafe. They'll affirm that actually people are unsafe. And as long as you're attracting unsafe people and unsafe situations, then you're not able to live the best way that you know how. You're not able to live in purpose. The other thing you need to look into is, were you overly protected? Did you have parents that were overprotected? That today you are scared to step out because in their being overly protective, they made you feel like people are unsafe and the world is unsafe. You can't be yourself, you cannot step out. So if you want to live your best life, you may need to actually go back and look at how the environment and the people that raised you shaped the view that you have of yourself. And these are things that I encourage you to do. So if you find this information useful, if these videos are adding value to your life, please share with friends and relatives. Remember, we have done episode 1 and 2. If you haven't watched them, check out the links in the comment section and go back and watch those videos. I will see you in episode 4. And as always, this is Coach Ruth Waithera of the Soul Clinic. Now, the whole Soul Clinic will fix your pain, will help you feel good and live holy, because we want to see you living